Hi everyone, and welcome to class number 7 of nuk309. And this week we pick up exactly from where we left in the previous class. We just finished creating a texture for the floor. We want to go back to Maya, do the texturing, shading, and of course lighting to get our first render. So let's go to the render layers, and we in the previous class we did some ambient occlusion renders. And for doing some lighting tests, we probably want to reduce the test resolution even further to have it going really fast. So let's go to options, test resolution, change it to 25%. And now the ambient occlusion goes really fast. And of course, now we want to go back to our master layer and do the lighting there. Let's select all the geo that we have here and assign a shader to them. Assign new material, and we want the Arnold AI standard. And this is the one Arnold shader that is basically used to create almost any kind of material. Very useful. And we just want to put a general kind of grayish material over everything so we can set up the lighting and then go and assign specific shaders to each piece. So let's go to our standard shader, and we'll just change the color to, say, medium gray. And now we can do a test render, and of course it will be totally black because we have no lights. And Arnold doesn't take into consideration the Maya default light setup, so you have to add at least one light source. And the first light source we want to add is the skylight, is the ambient light. Our shot is pretty much ambient. There is some directional light, but it's not like a blue sky kind of contrasty shot. So the ambient light is very important. So you can just click on this little icon here, or you can go to Arnold lights and add a sky dome light. It's the same thing. Let's add one, and you can see it's adding a sphere. And if we look in the perspective view, here's the sphere. You can scale it up or down. It doesn't really matter. Let's select it and just scale it up. It could be tiny or big. It will do the same work. It's virtual. And at this point I like to switch to viewport 2, which gives a better indication of lighting and textures, just a better OpenGL preview. So if you have the correct card, that will work beautifully. Let's go back to our camera, and well, let's choose this area and let's do a little test render. And now you can see that we have something that looks a little bit like ambient occlusion, much grainier though, because now we're doing direct reflection of surfaces over surfaces and so forth. And so let's talk briefly about quality settings in Arnold. Let's open the render settings, and there's a bunch of different parameters in Arnold to set things, but really the area where you want to concentrate, at least at this stage, is here. And it's a bunch of numbers for AA samples, diffuse, glossy, and refraction. And very clearly, the higher the numbers, the more sampling goes on, the smoother it will be, less noisy. What you have to remember is that the first one that's called AA samples is basically a multiplier for the others. So if you change that one, it will also multiply these, even though you don't see those numbers here specifically being multiplied. And if we take that and save it, and then we go and change this to say 5 and re-render, you see that it takes longer, but there is an improvement in the amount of noise and graininess that happens. Additionally, you can specifically change the sampling for diffuse, which is a general color, for glossy, especially when you have very bright materials or glossy materials that start flickering or getting artifacts, and refraction, which has to do with transparency, which we basically will not need here because we don't have any transparent surface. So for now, you really don't want to have anything slow you down. So we can change it back to, say, 322, the way it was set up, and that's totally fine. That will be fast. And actually, that little bit of amount of graininess sometimes helps make things look more rough, more real, not too clean. Later on, we'll, of course, take these numbers and go higher up with them to get a cleaner render. For now, that's fine. So we got a general ambient color here. Maybe at this point it's a good idea to bring back our background so that we can see this in context of the shot. So let's close this for a moment. Go to our camera, go back to environment, to the image plane, and turn it back on to RGB or RGBA, and now we can see it. This will help if we do another test render. It just helps kind of getting a feel of the sky, of the environment, even her. So this is still not there. Let's go back to our skylight, sky dome, and now it's set to white, which is always a good start, and our sky is kind of whitish. What I like to do usually is at least make a little gradient, and we're not even using an HDRI image here, which you can, of course, but it's not really necessary for this shot. We just need a general sky, ambient color, and a directional light to give it some kick. It would be nice to at least make this a gradient so it's not constant throughout. So let's select a ramp here and let's re-render again. And the default ramp in Maya has this great Technicolor setting, which you can see now. We can actually turn on the IPR so that it will update in real time. You can select a small area and that will update. So let's get rid of the red. Let's get rid of the green. Let's go to the blue and change this back to white. And all we want to do now is add another point for the gradient at the bottom and make it a bit darker, grayish. And that's basically what happens usually with sky. The horizon is a little bit darker, more hazy, especially if the sun is up in the sky. The top of the dome will be brighter, and we want to have just that little thing. And you can see that if I move the gray point higher up, it's going to affect the amount of light on the scene. So let's keep it down like this. And what else can we do? We can go and make it brighter overall. You can change the exposure, and that's already way too much. Let's just add a tiny little bit, let's say 0.3, just to make it slightly brighter. We still don't have shaders. Just to remind you, everything right now is just gray. So that will be a basic setup for now for the sky dome. Let's close the render window now because we want to go and add a directional light. And we can switch to perspective. And let's just create a directional light and move it up a little bit, and it's pretty tiny, so we want to scale it up so we can actually see it, and the arrow, and now it's pointing straight forward. We want to start it pointing basically down. Let's look at the rotation. So we want it like -90. That is all the way straight from the top of the sky. Now we don't want it coming totally straight down. As you remember when you looked at the shots, the light, and here's another thing, the light in our plate, the light on her, is not the same lighting exactly as we have on the background. I mean, we're cheating there. So we want to get something here that's in between that will help us kind of connect between the foreground plate and the background plate. So what we want to do is make the light coming slightly from the right side. So we want to rotate this a little bit, something like this. And also make it come, let's say, yeah, something like -7 here. But we also want to hit it from the camera and not have it totally backlit so we can see some features and some highlights. So we want to cheat this also a little bit, and around -70 here, and that should be it. And let's do another IPR now, and you can see that everything has gone brighter. And if we take the sky dome for a moment and just turn the intensity all the way down to 0, what we're seeing now is our directional light, and it's not strong enough. The sun is strong there, so let's go and change the intensity to 3. You see the shadows are really, really strong here. So what we can do is go to shadows, make the shadow color a bit more grayish, something like this, because really there are no strong shadows on the plate or even in the background. And another thing we can do is make the shadows more diffused, more blurred, and that is done in the light angle. So the higher the light angle number is, the more spread out the shadows are, as you can see. Let's put it at like 5. So now we've got this kind of bright light and getting some nice shadowing here. We also want to make it slightly yellowish. I mean, it is the sun and now it's totally white. So let's go here, turn it toward orange, yellow, and just slightly give it a tint that you can see. And now we can go back to the sky dome and bring it back up. And now we've got this really strong kind of blown up light over everything. Let's keep it like this because our scene is very strongly lit. And we'll tweak the lights when we start putting on the shaders and the correct colors for everything. Let's close the window and let's select the floor. And before we assign our material, we just want to make sure that the UVs are set correctly. And they should, because it's just a default plane that we didn't even tweak at all. But just to make sure, you want to go to Window, into the UV texture editor. And basically, if you see the whole thing as a square and our plane is square, we know that the UVs are assigned correctly. And that's all we need. We do want to assign a new material for this one. So let's go into Assign New Material, another AI standard. And now we go all the way to the diffuse color. And of course, we want to load in our texture file. So we click on File and then browse to where our texture is. And at this point, we can enable textures in the viewport to see it. And the first thing that comes in immediately to mind is that the tiles are way too big. They need to be about twice as small. And the easiest way to do it is just to tile the texture twice. So let's go to the Place 2D texture and we'll change the repeat UV on both U and V to 2. And that looks much better and also kind of aligns much more nicely with the edges. And it's fine that we're repeating because really at no point in the shot do we see the entire floor, so it's not going to be apparent. So this is good. Now let's go back to the shader and let's do a little render here. And this is all nice. It's kind of a bit too uniform. And the one kind of quality that we want to get, and if you look back at the plate, you can notice it, because the floor is polished and kind of reflective in a way. There are areas that get blown out because they reflect so much light, and the light is strong and coming straight from above. And you see it in the plate. We want to get a sort of a quality like this here. And in Arnold, specular really defines how reflective a material is. You'll hardly ever need to use reflection here, because if you set the specular, say, to weight 1 and roughness to 0, you'll basically get an almost like a mirror reflected. So it's nice because it is physically accurate. And what we want to do, and let's turn on the IPR here. Oh, you know what? Before we do that, we want to add our bump maps. We almost forgot. So go to bump mapping, click here again. We want to load a file, and in here we want to load our floors bump. We can go back here, Place 2D texture, change this to 2 and 2, and we can leave this setting by default. Uses bump and the bump depth to 1. It will really help a little bit with the reflection or the speck. So let's go back up to the shader and do an IPR now. And let's select an area of the floor to update, let's say here. And now we want to start pulling up the weight of the speck. Let's pull all the way up. And now it's really getting blown up because it's basically reflecting this very white, strong light that we have, skylight. So let's pull it back to, let's say, 0.5, somewhere in the middle. And that's giving us this kind of nice, kind of blown up quality. Let's just make the roughness a bit higher. And that's kind of nice. It just feels like the entire reflection is too bright. So maybe we just have too much skylight in there. We can go into the sky dome light and basically just reduce the intensity to say 0.8. And that's starting to look really nice because there are areas that are still keeping the color yellow and areas that feel like they're blown out because they're reflecting. And that takes us to something that looks closer to the floor in the real shot, and it will add some, you know, element of photorealism, that things are not all kind of nicely exposed, but some areas are getting overexposed, and that will work with all our shot. Let's just render this whole frame to see how it looks. And that's pretty nice. And another thing we have to remember is that we're going to break up the lighting in these areas by adding some pots with plants in them, which will create more shading and ambient occlusion over these areas. So I think when we have it all there, the floor is going to look really nice. So let's move on to the other pieces now. Okay, so for the two base cubes, we really want to go as simple as we can. All we want is them to be white, just white paint. So let's select both of these bases and we'll assign a new material to them. And this will be, of course, an AI standard, and we'll call it base matte. And we want to keep the color white. I don't think we want to do anything with spec at this time. Let's see how it looks. Yeah, I think that's working nice, and of course they're totally white, so you can see the graininess and the noise from the low settings. When we up it, it's going to actually add nice shading over there, so we don't need much. Let's go back to the fence, and all the fence objects are basically the same material, a sort of a painted metal. So let's select the railing poles and the tops, and we'll assign a new material to them. And we call this railing, and we don't want it white. It could be any color really, just not to attract too much attention. I like to keep it gray, but it can definitely be blue or green or whatever you fancy. So let's click on the color. We want to make it kind of a darker gray, around 0.3 or something like this. To make it feel more like metal. And this one, of course, needs spec, and we want to go and look at an area where we see more of the rail, let's say here, and do an IPR. Now of course it's looking very matte, not shiny enough. So here we want to turn on Fresnel, and when Fresnel is set to 0, there is no angle of incidence, so you'll basically not get anything. You want to start turning it up, but first let's turn the weight all the way up for the specs. And let's keep the roughness here, or by about 0.5. And now we really want to start upping the Fresnel, and you don't want to exaggerate, because as soon as I go like 0.15, it's already too specky or too reflective and starting to look like chrome or aluminum, and we want to keep it more in the area of painted metal. Let's try 0.1, and yeah, I think this is not bad. If we reduce the roughness again, it's gonna feel very, very shiny, as you can see. Let's put it at 0.4. And now you can see the nice spec we're getting from the bevel that we did there in the previous class. Let's render this whole frame. Yeah, I think it's not bad. Maybe it's a bit too shiny. If you feel it's too shiny, you can up the roughness to spread the highlights a bit more, make it feel less reflective, more painted. But this is a pretty, yeah, let's leave it like this, a little less shiny, a little less reflective. Let's take a look at another frame just to get a feel right here. Yeah, that's not too bad. At this point, you might want to go up and up the quality. So let's say we go to 4 here, 3 on the diffuse, 3 on the glossy sample. Refraction doesn't really matter because we don't have anything refractive, and we can do another render. Yeah, and this is feeling nicer, and you can see that the little bit of graininess actually doesn't hurt on the white surface. It makes it feel a bit more real, I think, and not as clean. Because the problem with CG render is that they usually are too clean compared to plates. So that's nice. What we're missing here, if we want to render something out and test it in Nuke, of course we need to up the test resolution back to like 50%. We also want to turn down the background image plane, and we're missing motion blur. So first, let's set this up, and this is very easy. We go back to the render settings and go to motion blur, and we enable it. And now we just want to set the motion range, and like we felt before, for some reason motion blur comes out really strong even in Nuke, so we might as well change it here to say 0.3 and see if that gives us a bit more subtle motion blur, and we can do another test render to see how it looks. And you know, it's it's funny because it's applying motion blur also to the image plane of the background. So that is feeling pretty nice. Let's go and select the camera and turn off the image plane there. And now we can also, yeah, now you can see the motion blur there. And that bit of graininess is not bad either, actually, when you see it in the comp. And that's good. So all we need to do now is do a test render at half res and also render out the AO. So when you want to render out the AO, all you need to do is go back to your render layer, switch to the AO, and everything in the AO is still kept the same because we used overrides here in the previous class. So it separates the master layer shaders to the master layer and keeps the AO layer with AO shaders. So let's do these two and then check them up in Nuke. So I rendered out frame 126 and brought it into the Nuke comp. Also rendered the AO layer of it. And if we look at it in the context of the comp, it's starting to look pretty nice, I think. We definitely have a problem with the distortion. Same that we had before, it's pulling the edges, so we'll need to overscan in Maya the next time we render. We need to set this up. And I just want to show you the importance of the AO. Before that, I just color corrected the render a little bit to take out some of the yellowishness and make the whites a bit more white to kind of fit in here. It's a little tweak, I think, that helps. And to put in the AO, we want to use a merge node and we want to set it to multiply. So basically, everything that's darker than white in the ambient occlusion will darken the render. So let's set this to multiply. And now it's lost because if we don't connect anything here, we connect generally black, so it just multiplies everything to 0. If we add the ambient occlusion, you can immediately see the difference. The ambient occlusion really intensifies the shading or the shadowing, and it adds definition, it adds contrast, but usually you don't want to just mix it all the way in. You want to use a little bit of it just to give some more definition to your render, depending on how it looks in comp. So the AO is always very useful. Here's another rendered frame 156, and the ambient occlusion is doing its thing. And it's looking nice, but the more I look at it, the more I realize we're missing an element on the railing. I mean, right now, think of it. You can easily go in between the vertical poles and just fall off the balcony. So we need something to add there to make this, so that this railing makes sense. So, you know, it's always good to see things in context. Sometimes you realize these things. So let's go back to Maya and add this little detail. So what I think we want to add, and that's a common design element in railings, is two horizontal thin bars that go through the entire length of the railing. So let's do that. Go back to perspective. We want to create a cylinder for that, and let's make the radius, we want it like thin, pretty thin, and the height 1000 as usual, and of course we want to rotate it on the Z. And now we probably want to go to the top view and move it to be right under there. Also change to, so we want to align it with the bars of the railing. And now we can go to side view. Move it up to a position. And let's look in perspective. And again, it might be useful to click insert at this point and move the pivot point closer to the edge there. And now we can align it. And let's move the pivot point right here to the center. And now we can duplicate and rotate this cylinder. And now we can select both cylinders, duplicate again, and move down. Yep, something like this solves the issue of the railing, adds another little nice detail. Let's group all these. And we basically want to copy the same material as the other railing, so we can go and assign existing material and look for the railing material. And let's do a test render and see how this looks. Yeah, no need to render all the way through. That's probably what we need. Now in the next class we're going to create some plants to put on the balcony, and of course we need pots or bowls or whatever to hold them in. And I want to quickly, in the little time we have left for this class, just quickly show you one way of modeling. Of course, modeling things like pots, there are many ways to do it, and it's up to you to choose whichever way you feel most comfortable with. I don't feel so comfortable working with splines and NURBS, and I usually like working with polygons and subdivision. And one nice thing about Arnold is that you can put a low-res poly model in there, and it will do the subdivision at render time. It's not really necessary for the kind of model we have here, which is very, very simple. But when you have very heavy scenes, it's very useful to keep all the subdivision only for render time. So let's do a quick one just as a little exercise, and then you can go ahead and do your own. So I'll start with the, and we can do it on an empty scene, because you can save them somewhere else and then import them into the scene and scale them. So scale is not really an issue here. Let's just create a cylinder, a default, and let's just scale it up a little bit. And we'll select faces, and we want to select all the faces at the top. So select this and then deselect all that. And now let's go to edit mesh and extrude, and we just want to offset a little bit to create the rim. And you can hold Control to make this a finer movement here, and then we can press G just to repeat extrude, and then we can extrude it down, and we can look at wireframe to see that we're not going through the bottom, something like this. And okay, let's go back to vertex, and we might want to change this, and we want to give it some shape, so maybe we want to lower it, make it a bit lower, and then take the whole bottom. Let's look again in wireframe to see that we're selecting both, and just take the whole bottom and just scale it down. That looks more like a pot. Maybe a little lower. And then we want to add some detail to it. And even at this stage, if you look at the object, you can just press 2 to see it subdivided, or 3 to see it subdivided without the cage. Let's go back to 1. And now we want to add some divisions here. So let's go to Edit Mesh, Insert Edge Loop tool. And we can insert an edge loop here. And now we want to select all these faces. So we go like this, but we don't want to select the inner faces, so we can just hold Control, do this, and now we only have this rim of faces. We can go and do another extrude and change the thickness to add a bit of a rim there, something like this. And again, let's look at it subdivided. And it looks nice, but it's a little soft overall. The curves, it's too curvy, so we want to make it more like a plant pot. And let's turn off the grid. We don't really need that. So at this point, we might look here. It's more helpful. Again, we just want to add some edge loops, one at the bottom, and maybe one over here to make it more of a pot. And we can leave the rim kind of circular like this. Let's go back to object mode. You know, and that could be a basis for making more of these. So you want to probably do several different variations of these, just like you have on a balcony. You have different sizes and type. Also, these usually stand on a kind of a shallow plate. You want to make these, and you can use the same procedure. And then in the next class, I will throw some textures on them and do a little shader, or you can go ahead and do that for Arnold. Just when you render test renders in Arnold and you want to see how something looks, don't forget to put a ground underneath it. Just put a plane with a gray shader there. Otherwise, the lighting will not feel right. And you can just throw in a sky dome light and just do your shaders based on that. Then when you bring it into the actual scene, you can always tweak the colors or the specs and so forth. So in the next class, we're going to go into, we're going to create some of these and then go into SpeedTree and create some plants for the balcony and maybe even animate some of them. So I'll see you all next week. Bye-bye.